Welcome to On the Verge. This is Zach Spedden, joined as always by Bob Phelan and Nick Stevens. And we're coming to you with our second to last episode of 2022. And we've got a lot to get into tonight, including projected rosters for the Orioles minor league affiliates in 2023, going all the way from Norfolk down to the FCL. So we're going to have a pretty in-depth look at that. In addition, we're going to talk about some free agent signings that the Orioles have made in the last week, including Adam Frazier and the return of Michael Givens. That'll be on tonight's episode, but we'll start off with the projected rosters. If you go over to BaltimoreSportsAndLife.com now, you can see the full list written by Bob. And Bob, as he does every year, takes a really thorough look at the depth chart throughout the Orioles organization, puts together a starting nine for each team, plus a bench, plus a starting rotation and a bullpen, and then assigns them what he labels a watchability rating, which kind of gives us a snapshot of how much talent that team does or doesn't figure to have going into next season. So, Bob, just give the listeners a little bit of background on the process, how you come up with the watchability ratings, and what your impressions are as you look at this list as a whole.
Yeah, it's one of the more fun things I get to do as we go deep into the off season. And, there's a couple months still before spring training starts, but at the end of every season, it's sad that it's over, but it's also like you get a little burnt out. You need a break from baseball. And basically my process of writing this article is what gets me excited and recharged to get ready for the next season. And yeah, I just take a look at how the year ended as far as the rosters are concerned. Guys that will repeat the level, guys that are going to probably get bumped up a level, and putting these rosters together. Yeah, it can be tough because especially right now with the Orioles system so deep and talented, it's like, okay, I have 6 starting pitchers in each of these rotations and still have to relegate talented guys that I think could be in a starting rotation at the minor league level to the bullpen to start. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, and you just get to put these names in places and look forward to going and see them play at those places.
On that note, we'll start at Norfolk, where kind of a veteran influence on the Tides roster, especially on the position player side, with some players that the Orioles have acquired this offseason. But you do also have some top prospects slated to start there, including Connor Norby, Colton Cowser, and Joey Ortiz in the starting lineup. And then some really interesting arms on the pitching side, including Drew Rom, Ryan Watson, Justin Armbruster, and Chris Valamont, who is slated to return to Norfolk after a little bit of a breakout last summer at Bowie before a more up and down result once he got to AAA. And then also a good bullpen where you have a couple of arms who arguably could start in the major leagues, including Nick Vespi and Mike Ballman. So, Bob, I'll start with you on Norfolk. Kind of give us your takeaways from this projected roster.
Yeah, I think with the Orioles getting back into contention, or hoping to at least, ended last year on a positive record, aren't doing as much through free agency as a lot of Orioles fans may want. But I think you can just see the way they're attacking minor league depth, minor league signings, waiver claims, and just the way the roster looks to be going to be constructed at Norfolk this year. It's a lot more like, who are guys that if we suffer an injury at the major league level, these guys can come up, have experience in the major leagues, and can step in and produce at a decent level. Like you see the minor league signings, Franchi Cordero, Nomar Mazara, Josh Lester, and Lewin Diaz was a waiver claim who would have to pass 2 waivers, but it's potential that he could do that. And same on the pitching staff with like Spencer Watkins is a guy that you don't want to count on, but if you need him in a pinch, former guest of the podcast will step up and do a good job. And you also have these high-end prospects in our top 10, like you said, Norby, Cowser, and Ortiz, as well as Hudson Haskin, who is a little underrated in the 15 range, but Maverick Hanley as well. Like all of these guys you could see getting a shot at the major league level at some point in 2023, depending on how things break. And the pitching staff, I think, is really underrated with Drew Rom recently added to the 40-man, Ryan Watson, minor league pitcher of the year, Justin Armbruster, great guest to the podcast as well. And you could have Noah Denoyer up from AA, spoiler alert, in quick amount of time as well. So I think it's just a deep roster of veterans and guys who will probably be veterans before long.
Yeah, this projected Norfolk roster makes me wish I still lived down there in the Hampton Roads region, because I spent many years watching some really bad Norfolk teams, and like even someone like me who can sit here and find the random bullpen arm to get excited about, it was tough to watch those Norfolk teams most nights. But I think with some of the projected veterans here, you see what type of player the Orioles are targeting to fill these spots. And it's guys who hit the ball incredibly hard, guys with good prospect pedigree. So even those veteran names, your Diaz, if he slips through waivers, which I hope he does, I feel like he's one or two on the DFA block. And speaking of, Michael Gibbons signing right before we came on air, like that, Diaz could be one of those guys. But with these guys, Daz Cameron, even Josh Lesh, like these are guys with a little bit more in the tank, and they all hit the ball incredibly hard. That I think is going to make Harbor Park, which has always kind of looked like a much better pitcher's park than hitter's park, especially with that wind coming off the river and right center field. I don't think that's going to be an issue anymore. But I think you nailed the prospects right as far as looking at this roster and which prospects are going to be on Norfolk's roster. Got it right. I picked out one name though in particular that is really standing out to me, and it's Hudson Haskin. And you kind of referenced there by saying he's a little underrated. I said it last year, and I'm going to say it again. Like, I think Hudson Haskin is extremely underrated in this system. Maybe not extremely, but vastly underrated in this system. I think people focus too much on that unorthodox, quote unquote, swing of his, but I think it's kind of irrelevant. And he did a really good interview, I think sometime last year, talking about that swing and how people have had comments about it for years, and yet he's still succeeding. He had an 821 OPS in AA last season, 15 home runs, 126 WRC plus, all solid numbers. And one thing that I kept seeing in like the post-draft reports and early prospect reports about him was that if he starts to swing for more power, the strikeouts are probably going to increase. Well, he went from 5 home runs to 15 home runs last year at AA, and the strikeout rate only jumped up a few ticks to 21%, which I don't think is alarming. And the walk rate was identical compared to last year, 9.2%. So he's a true center field prospect who's going to hold that position down in the major leagues if he gets there. I think he's just been a very quiet career for Hudson Haskin. So I think there's the past him, and there's another guy too that I think is criminally underrated, but I'm going to save that one for next week's show. But right now it's Hudson Haskin. Rom, same thing. It's looking at the pictures like Drew Rom. I hate this. He's a soft tossing lefty moniker that gets put on him. He's not Alex Wells. He's not Zach Lowther. Like the velo increases every year for real. The multiple arm angles. He came out with that interview when he was added to the 40-man roster about the changeup. That's something he's really working with. I mean, you look at his career numbers. I pulled him up here. He's 25-9 with a 3.41 ERA, 414 strikeouts and 353 career innings, all while being between 2 and 5 years younger than the competition at every stop. And you look at the ERA the first time in his career, AA and AAA last year, he had an ERA over 4, but the FIP was 3.62 and 3.16 in Bowie and Norfolk. And those were the lowest FIPs he had since rookie ball. So I think Rom is primed for a pretty big year, anchoring that Norfolk rotation. And yeah, that group of Watson, Armbruster, Valamont, I'm just hoping one of these guys at least really breaks out. Like whether it's a starter reliever, I don't really care, but Brian Watson was minor league pitcher of the year, huge strikeout numbers, didn't really walk anybody in AA. Justin Armbruster talked a lot about in reports and interviews about if Armbruster really develops that slider, he could separate himself. And that's what he developed last year in Bowie. So I think he could really separate himself. And Valamont's always had the stuff. I mean, that turnaround he had in AA from being in the Twins organization to when he came over and started in Bowie, just an incredible turnaround. I think a lot of people are already ready to DFA him tonight. But I'd be shocked if that happens before the season starts. And Valamont's someone that I'm still really intrigued to watch. But one of those three guys, I think, is going to take a huge leap forward next year.
Yeah, I feel like Haskin is the kind of guy that most organizations would be happy to have in the back part of their top 10 list. And he's nowhere near the top 10 in the Orioles system. Improving power numbers, good center fielder. And I think if he gets a full healthy season at Norfolk, you're going to see good things out of him. Before we move on to Bowie, I do want to ask one question of you, Bob, which is Jordan Westberg's not in this lineup. So where do you see Jordan Westberg starting the season?
How could I forget Jordan Westberg? No, I predicted him to either start the major leagues, start the season at the major league level, or be traded in a trade for a pitcher. So out of those 66.7% chance of not being on the AAA roster, of course, there's a chance he could start in AAA at least at the beginning of the year. Just move Josh Lester to the bench and put Westberg there for a couple weeks until he gets called up. But I'd also like to just note that the bullpen is pretty ridiculous at Norfolk here, especially if things go the way that I predicted with guys like Nick Vespi and Mike Baumann, who had successes at the major league level last year back in the AAA bullpen. I mean, Vespi, I'd love to see him get a shot to just stick in the major league level, but, we have a loaded bullpen and he has options. So I feel like he might be another up and down guy this year. You also have the AFL guys, Easton Lucas and Nolan Hoffman, and last year's AFL Connor Loprich with Cole Uvila coming back after a nice year last year, and my guy Adam Stauffer, who I will continue to boost up no matter what. The bullpen, and even Vivek says Yanier Cano is an option. A lot of these guys, the Orioles just signed to minor league deals today, so the bullpen in Norfolk should be pretty good.
Yeah, I really love this bullpen, and those 3 minor league signings they made today definitely we're already got some wrinkles thrown into this projected roster. But yeah, and another thing back to Hudson Haskin too, I forgot to mention he only played in 26 games at High A before starting last year in Double A. So again, just something else to consider when thinking about Hudson Haskin. But like this bullpen, yeah, Mike Baumann, I just think just leave him in the bullpen, honestly, and let's go from there. I'm still haven't changed my mind there. But elsewhere, like Nolan Hoffman, Easton Lucas, Connor Loprich, Lucas had a good season in Bowie and has gained a ton of steam this offseason, especially when he was in the Arizona Fall League. Nolan Hoffman had an unbelievable Arizona Fall League. And yeah, the K to strikeout, the strikeout to walk numbers were unbelievable in the AFL. We just didn't get to see him last year because of injuries. I wouldn't be surprised if he's in the majors at some point in 2023, assuming all things go right for him to start the year. And Connor Loprich, honestly, I think he's someone that no one else is going to talk about, but I think the stuff plays pretty well. And he's got like identical numbers between lefties, righties. So he's an interesting arm. And Cole Uvila, just shout him out. Rule 5 pick, minor league Rule 5 pick last year. I think he started out, was it Uvila, Vespi, and who was it that he got cut? There's another reliever. Those guys did not allow a run like ever to begin the season. Vespi kept that streak going. Obviously, the other guy, I can't remember who it was now, who got cut.
Right-hander who's been
Tim
in the
Naughton?
a while. Tim Naughton,
yeah. He got cut. Uvila stayed in Norfolk all season, and like look at his splits. He had one bad month. Month of June was a disaster at 11.74 ERA, but the rest, I mean, 0 runs, 2 runs, 1 run, 3 runs, 1 run. Like he had a really good year except one bad month. So I'm curious to see what he can do next year if he gets a shot finally.
Yeah, I gave this roster an 8 out of 10. Do you guys agree with that? We should go and see if I'm way off on these. I'm pretty high on all of these rosters to be honest, but I feel like that's just because there's too much talent and depth to the system.
Yeah, I'm trying to see what you gave the other ones without spoiling it and see like where they rank. It's definitely not my favorite, which is like there's Connor Norby and Colton Cowser and Joey Ortiz, right? And maybe Jordan Westberg, like all in this lineup, but it's not my favorite. But yeah, I think that sounds about right.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And I mean, I'm sure that there is a little bit of a balancing act too that goes into whether or not a team has a lot of prospects versus whether it's competitive. And Norfolk figures to be competitive with a lot of prospects early on, but then the potential for things to turn over. And if they do turn over, there could be some insurgents from Bowie. Now, the only player who figures to be in our top 10, or at least one of the players that's definitely going to be in our top 10 from this list, is last week's guest, Kobe Mayo. But you also have Heston Kjerstad projected for Bowie's lineup, along with Daryl Hernandez, and a couple of guys that I think we could see better production from this year. And actually 3 guys in John Rhodes, Cesar Prieto, and Dante Williams. That's part of the lineup. It also includes T.T. Bowens, Colin Burns, Connor Pavloni, with a bench of Randy Florentino, Adam Hall, Billy Cook, and Zach Watson. So a lot of speed there. And then meanwhile, the pitching staff, if you want to look for breakout candidates, you might want to look at Bowie's pitching staff a little bit. You have Cade Povich and Chase McDermott, who were brought over in deadline deals last year for Jorge Lopez and Trey Mancini, respectively. On the Verge favorite, Gene Pinto, along with Carlos Tavera, Peter Van Loon, and Noah Denoyer, who probably could go to AAA, but a lot of depth at Norfolk combined with some missed times of injury last year pushes him back to Bowie. And then in the bullpen, you got the likes of Cade Stroud, Ignacio Feliz, Brandon Young, Houston Roth, Xavier Moore, Daniel Lloyd, and Clayton McGinnis. So certainly a pretty high upside bullpen there in Bowie. Nick, I'll start with your thoughts on this team.
I'll start with the bats and just say, like, there's a lot of home run potential with this lineup. Like, Del Hernandez has real pop. Kerstad, we saw what he was doing out in Arizona. He could put up those same numbers in Bowie. We don't need to explain Kobe Mayo any further. Like, TT Bowens, those numbers in Aberdeen, I think were a product of Aberdeen. We know TT Bowens hits the ball extremely hard. I was hoping he would have got promoted to Bowie at some point last year just to see what he has. But I think with some of the other guys like Kerstad, I think that is right that he starts in Bowie. I don't know if I think that Arizona Fall League campaign he had really cemented that for me. Like, I doubt he goes back to Aberdeen. Get him to Bowie, coming off the hot AFL experience. It's a hitter's ballpark. Let's see what you got. I'm just waiting for the point where he's adjusting to AA and he's hitting like barely 200 2 weeks into the year, and people are going to label him a bust because whatever. But give Heston Kerstad some time. He'll be all right. But I picked another guy out of this lineup that I'm most intrigued by here, and it's John Rhodes. To be completely honest, like, shout John Mioli, his Substack, again, maximizing playoff odds. Go subscribe. He had a piece last week, talking about looking at underlying batted ball data and picking out some guys who he thinks could break out in 2023. And John Rhodes was one of his guys, and he noted 15% in zone whiff rate and 19% chase rate, both of which are very good. We don't have access to those numbers, but you can see like a swinging strike rate on Fangraphs. And John Rhodes, if you go back the last couple of years he's been in the organization, I think only like Joey Ortiz and Adley Rutschman they lead the way as far as best swinging strike rates in this organization. But John Rhodes is right there. And I just think that he's already one of the most athletic players in the system. He was hurt for so much of last year. I think he had that wrist injury that I think probably just lingered for a lot longer than he had hoped. So he hasn't really played much. He doesn't swing and miss. A lot of that positive swing decisions, he's kind of one of the kings of that in this organization. So I think if he comes back next year and he's fully healthy and he begins in Bowie, I certainly believe John Rhodes is probably one of the bigger guys to watch in terms of bats, at least, that could break out here in Bowie.
Yeah, completely agree with Rhodes. I think if he didn't hurt his wrist, I think last year would have been that big breakout that we kind of called coming into 2022. But if he's healthy and starting in AA Bowie after getting a taste of it, even if he was a little bit hurt at the end of last year, I feel like he could really take off. And obviously, Kobe Mayo, I mean, he just turned 21 years old. He got a taste of AA last year. I could honestly just see him becoming one of the top 10 prospects in baseball before too long, going into next season and just going off. Heston Kerstad, how exciting. Dale Hernandez, like, this is maybe not, have a bunch of top end guys that are gonna, hope that we can get them to Baltimore by July or anything like that. But this is the next wave. And I think there are some breakout candidates. Cesar Prieto might have a better second year than first year as he gets more adjusted. But it's like Vivek said, this is the best, or at least my favorite rotation in the minor leagues coming into next year, with Cade Povich, really serious breakout candidate in the Jorge Lopez trade. Noah Denoyer, yeah, I think you could make a case to put him in AAA to start the year, but it's a little bit loaded. And I went with Stallings just because he pitched in AA all of last season over him to start the year. Chase McDermott, big upside. Our favorite, Gene Pinto, Carlos Tavera, kind of like John Rhodes on the pitching side. I feel like last year would have been his breakout if he didn't get hurt. And I'm going to expect him to break out this season instead. Peter Van Loon had a great season. And there's 3 starters in the bullpen: Houston Roth, Ignacio Feliz, Brandon Young, coming back from injury. But you could see some tandems here, or at least 4 or 5 innings like they did last year. And I think every time you turn on a Bowie Baysox game, you're going to at least have a starting pitcher on the mound that's well worth watching.
McDermott is a guy that really interests me because you have to watch his stuff to believe it, especially that fastball. I think I said that after one of his starts when he got to Aberdeen, it almost looks like his fastball approaches the zone, suspends itself in midair, and then gains velocity and rises up at the last minute. That's not the kind of thing you see very often. And his Bowie numbers last year are a little bit deceiving when you consider that he was lit up in his first two outings. One against Somerset, the Yankees affiliate, and then Altoona in the outing after that, the Pirates affiliate. But then he was pretty effective the rest of the way there, including 9 strikeouts and 4 2/3 in a game against Richmond. That was his second to last start of the season. So there was a little bit of a positive upward trend with McDermott at the end of last season that I kind of hope carries over. And same thing with Povich. Povich, some ups and downs at Bowie, but there's a reason to believe that with a longer run there, he's going to pitch well. And one thing I would also encourage our listeners to do, and I'll remind them of this as the season gets closer, is to really watch that home run to fly ball rate at Bowie. In the last few years, it has been a home run hitter's park. So you might have a pitcher there whose numbers are a little bit better than what they're indicating because that home run to fly ball rate might be higher than it would be elsewhere.
And I just think with this staff, specifically Povich and McDermott, this is definitely probably one of my favorite pitching staffs in terms of like more proven talent. This is definitely going to be the top rotation and bullpen to watch. But I think with Povich and McDermott, like you see a lot of still like kind of negative talk around these two guys because you just looking at the surface level AA numbers, like Zach mentioned, yeah, they're not super encouraging. And also just the fact, going back to the Trey Mancini, Jorge Lopez deals, I don't know, like they're all connected to this. So maybe they're always going to be connected to that. So I don't know if people just still have that on their mind, but like from what we've heard, if I remember correctly, right, like the organization really didn't adjust much with these guys when they came over. So you got a guy specifically in Cade Povich who didn't really pitch too much before he came into the Orioles system, at least in the pro ranks. I think he flashed some of the best stuff in the entire organization behind Grayson Rodriguez and D.L. Hall. And like, I just think that if you look at, trying to pull up his numbers here, if this thing will load. Yeah. Just 10 pro innings in 2021. And then he had 90 innings under his belt before being promoted to Bowie for his last 6 appearances. So I just think trying to adjust to AA at the age of 22. So he was still young for that level, trying to adjust to AA in a brand new organization that I don't think really put their full touches on him yet. Crazy ending this college year with COVID, getting traded midseason, which I think was a surprise. All of that coming together. I just think 2023 is a stable year for him. He goes into the offseason with the Orioles, give him a full plan of what they want to see changed and tweaked, and he works on that. I think he flashes, top 10 prospect stuff in this system, no doubt. And Chase McDermott, like I remember watching him and writing about him when he was at Ball State, and just he comes from an underrated program. Ball State is just one of the more underrated programs in terms of pumping out pitching prospects, I think. If it clicks for him, I'd be more inclined to kind of view him as a bullpen piece. That control is a bit of still an issue for him, to be honest. But even if it clicks and he becomes a dominant bullpen piece, like you mentioned that fastball, it really does. It literally, it's like a magic trick sometimes where it will just stop and then shoot up. And it's unbelievable to watch. But he's got to be able to control it. That's his big thing coming into 2023.
We'll go down to Aberdeen now, where there is a lot of talent on the offensive side, but again, some pitchers who could be guys that really rise up the system this year. The 2022 draft class is mostly present in Aberdeen with the likes of Judd Fabian, Dylan Beavers, and Max Wagner, along with one of last year's best breakout stories, Frederick Ben Cosme, who is one of 2 notable international prospects that would be in Aberdeen's lineup to be joined by Isaac De Leon. Should also mention 2 other 2022 draftees in catcher Silas Ardwan and shortstop Adam Crampton. Certainly give this lineup, along with Jacob Teeter, who missed a lot of last year with injury, some upside. Meanwhile, on the pitching side, Trace Bright, a pick out of Auburn in last year's draft, to be part of a rotation that could also include Davy Cruz and Juan De Los Santos. 2 good breakout stories from Delmarva last year, and along with a lot of interesting arms at the back of that rotation and in the bullpen. So after what was one of the best teams in IronBirds history last year, came within one win of the South Atlantic League Championship. The IronBirds at least should start out next year as a pretty good club again. Your thoughts on that, Bob? I'm guessing you're planning on taking the short trip over to Lido's Field at Ripken Stadium a lot early next year.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is the second year in a row where they have the highest watchability rating for me coming into the season, just because, well, it seems to be a trend with the Orioles. They're going to pick college bats a lot in the draft, and they tend to start in Aberdeen the following year. But, Fabian, Beavers, Wagner, and Trimble from the year before, but dealing with injuries, that's a loaded start to a lineup. And then you add in two of my personal favorites, De Leon and Ben Cosme, breaking out from the international scene. Jacob Teeter trying to stay healthy, get back on track. And then you mentioned Ardoin and Crampton. Just feel like what a great lineup right there. And the bench, you got Adam Retzback, another high-profile catcher from this last draft, Nolberth Romero, Trenton Craig, Isaac Bellany, just a bunch of guys that I enjoy watching. And this pitching staff is like, watch out, breakout central. I feel like at least 3 or 4 of these guys are going to be some of my breakout picks for next year. Trace Bright seems like there's a lot of helium for him already since being drafted. Davy Cruz and Juan De Los Santos already kind of broke out, but let's see if they can do what Gene Pinto did this past year and have some success at the next step on the stop. Cameron Weston shows some promise, Moises Chase as well. And in the bullpen, I just want to see that 7-footer Jared Beck start hitting 100 miles per hour. Randy Johnson, let's go.
Yeah, I'm looking at this projected roster, and I see Judd Fabian, Dylan Beavers, and Reed Trimble as a starting outfield. And if that's the case, like personally, that is my favorite positional group in the entire system, based on these preseason predictions. And I pulled up John Mioli, shout out to John again, an old piece he had from early in the season on Judd Fabian, with some quotes here from Brink Ambler, who was the hitting coach down at Delmarva last season. But he said, there's not really a whole lot of ways you can say it. I've seen a lot of really good players come through here, and Judd has been different. Offensively, he's been different. He controls the zone elitely, despite the fact that he was getting almost singularly game planned for every game he was in the lineup. Guys would pitch him so counter to every scouting report that we had. He was basically in a different universe as far as that was concerned. Guys were throwing him right on right changeups, throwing him totally different things than they would throw anybody else. A ton of credit to Judd. He was super mature in the sense of understanding that, being willing to change his game plan, and think along from at bat to at bat, think about what makes sense. Super high praise there for Judd Fabian. 22 games as a pro last year, OPS over 1,000, 19 walks, 21 strikeouts. We sent Cole Sulcer and Tanner Scott for Antonio Velez, Kevin Guerrero, Yaki Rivera, and Judd Fabian. That's a beautiful, beautiful trade. I mentioned the hot take I have about Reed Trimble. I got to save that for next week again, so I'm not going to spoil anything there. But Trimble, a lot of good things happening. For me, the pitching, I said it last year, and I'm going to say it again. This is the staff again where watch out for your breakouts. You look at that projected pitching staff, just like last year. Well, I don't know what we had projected for Aberdeen last year, but I think the break camp roster episode that we did, it was Gene Pinto and then a bunch of guys. Unless you follow this minor league season pretty closely, there's a lot of guys who weren't on the top 30 list, a lot of guys people really hadn't heard of. And then we saw Armbruster breakout, Noah Denoyer breakout, Carlos Tavera breakout. This is that group again. Trace Bright, you mentioned a lot of helium since he's been drafted. Davy Cruz rose into, he's became a top 30 prospect on Baseball America's list last year. Even if he starts in Delmarva, I think he spends a majority of his time in Aberdeen. Juan De Los Santos is the name that I've pushed out very hard since the beginning of last year. I'm going to keep doing it. Moises Chase, I think he had a couple injuries. He had a freak injury too at the beginning of the year, like slipping off the mound or hitting a weird patch in the pitcher's mound. But I think he could be a guy, one of these younger international guys who, if his offseason weight room program is legit and he continues to grow into that body and get stronger, he's going to have a really big breakout next year. I just think like Aberdeen has got to give us a good camera, give us a good announcer who actually talks to players and isn't just generically calling these games. I need good visuals of this Aberdeen pitching staff, because if you're a diehard, this is the staff that I think you need to watch very closely.
I want to point this out, and this is, something that I think is somewhat of an outlier if you're going to look at other high A rosters next year. Moises Chase is not going to turn 20 until June 9th. Juan De Los Santos won't turn 21 until May 25th. Davy Cruz will turn 19 in February. You have the possibility of all three of these guys in a high A rotation at very young age to be there. So, there might be some ups and downs, but all three of them are very high upside arms that I think with enough experience could really thrive in that environment.
Framber Valdez, Christian Javier, Urquidy. Astros had a history of doing this with their international pitchers. This is the Orioles version. So let's see who the first one to break through out of these guys is. And it's exciting to see this international presence start to trickle up towards the upper minors now. So can't say enough good things about it.
I mean, we did say we were talking about some of these younger international guys with someone in the organization, and the quote was, "They're coming." Talking about those international guys. So when he said that, I got a little chill down my spine. Just the way he said it and the smile on his face. They're coming. So yeah, if you have all these teenagers who, and all these guys, I think did have decent years. There was that quote. Was that Kobe Perez talking about how a lot of these guys were probably going to begin next year in Delmarva again, some of whom we'll talk about here in a second. But I mean, you saw Isaac De Leon get moved up to Aberdeen to close out last year and just go on a tear at the end of the year. Frederick Ben Cosme, talking about teenage bats, is he still only 19? Does he turn 20? I know his birthday's on Christmas. So I think he doesn't turn 20 for another week. He's going to be in high A. Like, not just the pitchers, the bats as well. You're going to have a lot of young international guys who we assumed would start next year again in Delmarva, but they've already got high experience under their belt. So maybe they are coming.
Christmas birthday, that is #legendary. Could you imagine if Ben Cosme puts on some muscle this offseason and on top of just refining his game? I mean, he already doesn't strike out. Man, I feel like it could be a huge year for him. And it's a tough ballpark to hit in, obviously, but just give him the shot. If he gets to AA Bowie at some point next year, that's the chains are off.
Yeah.
The international scene has arrived.
Well, if you want to look at where maybe the top international prospect in the organization will be to start 2023, you could look at the Delmarva Shorebirds lineup where Samuel Basayo will be part of a group that includes last year's #1 pick, Jackson Holliday, along with Creed Willems, Anthony Servideo, Misael Deson, returning from last year. Elio Prado, a guy with some upside, is going to be back there as well, according to Bob's projection. And you look at the rest of this group, some interesting bats with Anderson De Los Santos, Douglas Hodo, and Carter Young. And then on the pitching staff, again, some interesting young arms, headlined by Carter Balmer, who, in the little bit of time that we saw him last year, looked really sharp. Unfortunately, injuries limited his time in 2022, but certainly a lot of promise there. Juan Rojas is another interesting name to watch. Alfred Vega, who if you heard our last show recapping the Rule 5 draft, a guy out of the Yankees system that has a very interesting profile. Luis Ortiz, a left-hander, still young left-hander who we've been hearing about for a few years now because of a good curveball and some good pitches. He should be part of Delmarva's rotation as well. So, Nick, I think it's kind of interesting to look at this roster and compare it to what the Shorebirds started out with last year, which is an extremely young roster. And outside of a guy like Daryl Hernandez, not a ton of professional experience. This year's roster, or this 2023 roster, could be a little bit more balanced. And while I think you're going to see a lot of growing pains, there's also a good amount of upside here.
Yeah, I think watching this Delmarva team, it's going to be really fun to see who takes that next step in 2023. Because like you mentioned, last year especially, there were a lot of growing pains is a good word to use. I think for a lot of people, it was hard to watch this Delmarva team most nights. But at the same time, we have to remember that it was a lot of young international players who 2020, the season that did not happen, was supposed to be their first full seasons of pro ball, and they didn't get that. So those young international players were severely impacted by the pandemic. Now you've got the elimination of short season ball, so they're forced to make a pretty big jump into full season ball. So like I just mentioned, we saw some of these guys take that major step forward into the year in high A. I think that says a lot about who those guys are as prospects. But you still got a few guys here like Michel Deson, Elio Prado, and Creed Willems, I think are the big three who are going to repeat. Willems ended last year on a really positive note. Elio Prado got a nice write-up in John's newsletter about the underlying batted ball data looking really good. And same thing with Michel Deson. I mean, we had Daryl Hernandez on the show saying Deson was the guy who impressed him the most. He was the sleeper in this organization. Hopefully he puts everything together and has a big year next year. That would be fantastic if he did. But I think among all these guys, for me, the breakout is, and not just for this Delmarva team, but for the entire organization, I think my breakout is Anderson De Los Santos, just because, again, he was also in John's piece about the underlying batted ball data. We've heard those numbers, I think, for a while now, about his maturity, the baseball IQ for his age have been off the charts. And so hopefully next year in Delmarva, he breaks out and has a fantastic season. Samuel Basayo, I mean, John's prediction of Basayo being a top 5 prospect next year was shocking and awesome. Even if that doesn't quite happen, that speaks volumes about what he's hearing from inside the organization. So yeah, this is going to be a really fun team. Pitching wise, look through here, Juan Rojas, Nunez, Yaki Rivera, Alfred Vega are the 4 guys with a lot of upside that I'm really excited to watch. Preston Johnson's gained a lot of steam. Carter Baumler, baseball gods, if you're listening, I will do anything if you just keep this man healthy next year. He teased us with a lot of beautiful innings, 11 beautiful innings last season. And unfortunately, something else happened that ended the season prematurely, but this kid has not been able to pitch regularly since 2019. He was a junior in high school. I just want him to stay healthy because that stuff, we've talked about this before, outside of Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall, he probably had the highest ceiling in this organization. Even with the new additions, I'd still say he's top 3-4 highest ceilings in the entire organization as far as arms go.
Yeah, and I wrote in this article that, maybe a good idea for another article or podcast is to do individual watchability rankings where, if all things are equal, who are you going to turn the MILB TV to for a given at bat? And I think Delmarva has the number one, at least for me, in the system with Jackson Holiday. This is a kid who could skyrocket up lists this year and compete for a top 5, top 10, maybe, who knows, number 1 prospect in baseball. I don't expect him to be with the Shorebirds for long if he continues to do what he did at the end of last season. Super polished for such a young kid, and not far behind is Samuel Basayo for me. If he's up to bat, I want to see what he can do with the baseball, because what a freak of nature this guy is. Can't wait to see him just crush some baseballs against older competition. And yeah, just Vivek mentioned, could you comprehend a left side of the infield of Jackson Holiday and Anderson De Los Santos? And I can, and I'm excited about it because these guys are young, talented, and could be, the next wave of prospects in 3 or 4 years where, Gunnar Henderson, he's halfway through his Orioles tenure. Are they going to extend him, or are they going to make room for Jackson Holiday? I mean, let's not go that far down the road because hopefully he gets signed to a 12-year extension this offseason. But, you have to think ahead. And Elio Prado, like you said, when you were talking about Mioli's pieces about exit velocity and in-zone swing percentage, he was another name that popped there. And Carter Young, I'm going to perpetually forget about him. The overslot signing from this past draft, when we couldn't get one of the other guys, we kind of wrote off Carter Young as yeah, if we get him, cool, but it's kind of a bonus. Well, we got that bonus, and he did perform pretty well last year. The pitching, Juan Rojas is number 1 for me, and newly acquired Alfred Vega is probably number 2. But Carter Baumler, yeah, he's got to stay healthy because he still has that upside. And Reese Sharp, we talked about how we like him, and Preston Johnson. If Luis Ortiz is healthy, I think he's another one that could pop. And, it's another one of these depth rankings for me where I have them at an 8.5. Super fun team outside of Holiday, maybe no one that's wow, but just really fun roster right here.
Do you guys think there is any chance, though, that Jackson Holiday starts in Aberdeen? I mean, he wasn't supposed to play in Delmarva last year, but he did because he was so freaking good. And he was really, really good last year. And the underlying data matches that up. Any possibility he starts in Aberdeen, do you think?
I mean, I won't rule it out just because who's the starting shortstop at Aberdeen? Adam Crampton. I mean, I don't think he's going to hold back the development of a Holiday, but I would think maybe even Carter Young is a guy that could start at Aberdeen a little higher than I have him, more than Holiday. I just think you're going to see more of like the Jordan Westberg, Gunnar Henderson in 2021 type of year for Holiday, but you never know.
Yeah, I definitely would not count it out, just because of the upside that he has. And when you look in particular at his strikeout and walk numbers at Delmarva last year, that tells you that he has such an advanced plate approach for his age. If I had to guess, I think he does start back in Delmarva, but like Bob said, it probably should not be for a very long tenure. And if Aberdeen does start out with Adam Crampton at shortstop, they're going to have a very good defensive shortstop. He's not going to hold back Jackson Holiday, but he's certainly a guy that I think could help that team out a lot while we wait for Jackson Holiday to hopefully have that meteoric Gunnar Henderson, Jordan Westberg type rise. I'll go down now to the FCL, which actually concludes this list. And, should note it's a watchability rating for a team that you might not get to watch a lot of necessarily next year, but an 8 out of 10 is pretty good. And there's a reason for that. And that is because a lot of the international prospects that the Orioles acquired last year should factor in here, including Leandro Arias, Braylon Tavera, Aaron Estrada, who was the big breakout story in the Dominican Summer League this past season, a switch-hitting infielder with a good line drive stroke. Raylan Ramos was solid there as well. Michael Hernandez expected to go back and repeat the FCL. And then on the pitching staff, you have Zach Showalter, who was drafted by the Orioles last year and looks like a guy that could break out. Still a little bit of a mystery because we didn't see him at all after the draft last year, but a young arm that could add some upside to this group. So, Bob, we'll start with you here. This is a roster that I think a lot of our listeners probably have heard some of these names. There may be some names on here that they haven't heard of, but how would you assess this group?
It's kind of exciting. Aaron Estrada, the guy I didn't know I loved until, we saw the numbers he was putting up. Didn't even register when we were talking about the international signings in January, but here he is. He's probably the guy I'm most excited about out of Braylon Tavera, Leandro Arias, and Edwin Amparo, who I'm still excited about. Michael Hernandez, obviously not off to the best start in the world, but he's still got those tools. And, you're going to keep running him out there and trying to get things to click for him. And even on the bench here, like guys like Christian Benavidez, Alfredo Velasquez, Ellis Cuevas, these guys had fantastic DSL seasons. And we don't know how that translate Raylan Ramos as well to once they get in the FCL. But one thing I heard about this is, the FCL and DSL, yeah, they're playing games that count with box scores and stuff, but they're training throughout the whole summer. These are just the games that count. It's almost like if a third of someone's season is all that counted, or half of the season. I don't know exactly, but it's hard to really get a read on these stats and numbers. And the Orioles and the player development know more about what's going on, what's working, what's not. And we're going to have to rely on Eric Garfield, our buddy, to get some live looks, give his thoughts once he gets to see these guys stateside. And yeah, that pitching staff, like Cesar Alvarez and Anthony Murillo, two guys that I thought could have broken out this past season if they'd stayed healthy. Zach Showalter, maybe the next Carter Baumler without the injuries potentially. I mean, we don't know. It's a high school pitcher. The Orioles don't take many of them. The mystery of just not being able to see him or even look at a box score as a professional is kind of intriguing to me. And then there's a bunch of these pitchers from the DSL as well, like Harif Frias and Jose Leandro, Luis De Leon, that seem to have electric stuff just based on the numbers. Obviously, we can't see much here, but I'm excited to get them a little bit closer to stateside and being on our computer screen so we can watch them.
Harif Frias was a DSL All-Star last year. So, we got something cooking here. This pitching staff, I just want to see something because we talked about on our recap show. You really didn't see too many intriguing prospects down in the Florida Complex League last season. A lot of guys who didn't make it through the whole season. A lot of guys who got to Delmarva and ended up finding their way back to Sarasota. Your Steven Acevedos and those types of players hopefully this year these guys take a big step forward. I do think there's a lot of intrigue. You have a lot of older pitchers talking about Astros and their pitching development. The Orioles grabbed some of those older international guys. They signed late in the year. Some of them signed mid-season for, the minimum, I'm guessing, is what they signed for since it was so late in the process. The guys who were 20, maybe even 21 years old, some of them, but you're like Jose Leandro, Noel Cuevas, Andres Parra. These are some interesting lefty guys who had really good DSL seasons. So again, like Bob said, we have no idea how this is going to translate. Wasn't Cesar Alvarez the guy who Kobe Perez came on our show and was like, yeah, he touches 100? And we were like, who is Cesar Alvarez? Who is he talking about?
Maybe.
I think it was him. I already forgot. But if so, like that's intriguing right there. Luis Cesario is a name that I'm just going to remember just because he was part of the Paul Fry trade. But yeah, the bats, like this is the bigger class. Leandro Arias was a guy who Fangraphs put number 14 or like a top 20 prospect last season after the Orioles signed him in that international class. So we've heard a lot of good stuff about his batted ball data as well. So it'll be good to see him stateside. Aaron Estrada doesn't turn 18 until mid-January. I just looked. He was an all-star last year in the DSL, 45 games in OPS over 1,000. I know take DSL stats with a huge grain of salt. I honestly don't even spend too much time looking at them. But when you OPS over 1,000 as a 17-year-old and you have more walks than strikeouts, he had 29 walks and just 23 strikeouts, that could portend to something pretty good moving forward. So he's tiny. What's he listed at? I've had it, I lost it. He's listed 5'8", 142. So a tiny kid, but the guy hit the ball a lot last year. I'm intrigued. Exactly. Raylan Ramos and Gene Mata to me are the two names that I want to see what they got. They had good seasons in the DSL as well. And Braylon Tavera is still the guy. He was the headliner of that last year's international class, but I still, Fangraphs didn't have him in their top 50 Orioles rankings. I mean, Tavera is just, you don't see a lot of hype around him. So I'm waiting to see for myself, like what excites me about Braylon Tavera, to be completely honest. But he's, like you said, he's one step closer for us seeing for ourselves.
Alejandro Mendez was the guy that was touching 100. Yoni reminds us that does sound correct.
There you go.
But I know Cesar Alvarez was a guy that, had a fantastic 2021 in the DSL. And I feel like maybe that's the reason that the FCL was so screwed up last year as far as pitching goes, just because Murillo, Alvarez, Ortiz, a bunch of guys that Rangel, like Chase, injuries. And I know some of those guys were with Delmarva, not the FCL, but some of these international pitchers really didn't even get to put up any, if many innings this past season.
For the full list of projected rosters, go over to BaltimoreSportsAndLife.com. Click on the Orioles tab. You'll scroll down and find Bob's article there. You can see the full list as well as Bob's write-ups there as a companion piece to listening to this episode. And we'll transition now into talking about some of the Orioles' recent free agent acquisitions. But first, the wait is over. DraftKings Sportsbook, one of America's top-rated sportsbook apps, is officially live in Maryland. Now you can legally bet on all your favorite sports with DraftKings anytime and anywhere right here in Maryland. For a limited time, new customers who sign up with promo code On The Verge will receive $200 in free bets instantly. Why not roll the dice on the Baltimore Orioles in 2023? Use one of your free bets on the Orioles to win the 2023 World Series and turn a $50 free bet into $1,800. DraftKings is the best features, including same-game parlays, unlimited player props, and more, with fast and easy payouts right at your fingertips. DraftKings Sportsbook is where I go for all my sports betting needs. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use promo code On The Verge to get $200 in free bets instantly when you place a $5 bet on anything. Only at DraftKings Sportsbook with code On The Verge. Please play responsibly. For help, visit mdgamblinghelp.org or call 1-800-GAMBLER. Must be 21 years or older, physically present in Maryland. Eligibility and deposit restrictions apply. Bonus issued as free bets. See DraftKings.com/MD for full terms and conditions. Since our last episode last week, the Orioles have signed 2 free agents to 1-year contracts, including utility man Adam Frazier and reliever Michael Givens. Givens, a familiar name to Orioles fans, originally drafted by the Orioles years ago as a shortstop, eventually came through the system as a pitcher and was a member of the last two good teams that we've seen in Baltimore, 2015 and 2016. And then was around the Orioles until the 2020 trade deadline when he was sent to the Colorado Rockies as part of a package that included Tyler Nevin, Taron Vavra, and Misael Deson. Since then, Givens has pitched for three different teams and has been traded at back-to-back trade deadlines, 2021 and 2022. He ended last year with the Mets, and really the way to summarize Michael Givens now is that if you saw Michael Givens with the Orioles a few years ago, he's pretty much still that Michael Givens. Still a guy who's going to strike out a lot of batters, probably walk more than you would like. One notable change last year that we saw was Givens' ground ball rate did spike by just over 6%, while his home run to fly ball rate did dip slightly, though his fastball velocity was down a little bit. So some underlying numbers there to consider. And of the two signings, we'll start with Givens because it's probably the move that doesn't prompt much discussion about what the rest of the roster looks like. Other than that, Michael Givens is going to be in the bullpen somewhere. So, Nick, what are your thoughts here?
It's fine. I haven't really I saw this right before trying to put kids down for bedtime and get ready for this show. So haven't really processed fully, and I cannot do like the instant hot take reaction thing. But all I will say is that like you mentioned the stats, he's been consistent. We know his past here in Baltimore, what he's done on the mound. I really don't have an issue with it at all. It was what is he getting? $3 million guaranteed, I think it was. There's escalators, there's options. I don't know what the final thing is. I'm more curious about what does this mean in terms of is there a reliever trade happening? Who's getting DFA'd? I'm not sure. It's definitely interesting. I think if the Orioles would have already addressed the starting rotation, this would kind of be a non-story outside of Michael Givens is back. All right, cool. But since he's like one of the highest paid now players on this roster this year, it is a little bit more interesting, but I don't have an issue with it. Bullpen arms, I mean, I'm against giving bullpen arms big money, regardless of who they are, especially when a team like the Orioles, who's done a very good job of getting these waiver claims and turning them into useful pieces. And we know how volatile relief arms can be. But I'm interested to hear some explanation behind it about why the Orioles decided to bring him in. And I don't think any of that's been talked about yet, but we'll see what comes out in the next couple of days, I guess.
Yeah, familiar name, familiar face. He's a veteran reliever. Just get some veteran presence in the bullpen on a nightly basis. Maybe that's underrated, but as Vivek made a great point in our patron WhatsApp group, that this is probably not what Andrew Pilati wanted to see, the Rule 5 pick, trying to make the Orioles out of spring training. And maybe Dylan Tate, Sionel Perez, could it mean that one of these guys is going to be valued highly by another team in an upcoming trade for a starting pitcher? Who knows? We'll see. But at the worst case, it's just a cheap veteran bullpen arm that's going to take the Joey Crable role of the 6th, 7th inning, if you want to call that high leverage. So, I mean, he's been consistent. He's pretty much going to have an ERA between 3 and 3.50 for the most part. He's going to get ground balls. He's going to walk a couple guys, but he's going to strike out a bunch of guys. He's 32. He's not old, but he's not exactly young either. It's kind of a nothing burger. This is just, a steady, decent arm, just build on our strength. And there really is not a lot to say about signing a reliever for a mid bullpen option.
Yeah, so I'll read a report here from Mark Feinsand over at MLB.com. Givens is going to receive a $3 million salary next season. The option price for 2024 is valued at $6 million. This is a mutual option between the Orioles and Givens for 2024, meaning both sides would have to exercise it in order for him to be back. If Givens would decline his end of next year's option, he would receive a $1 million buyout. However, if he triggers that option, but the Orioles decline their side of the option, he'll receive a $2 million buyout. If both sides exercise it, it's $6 million for the 2024 campaign. The move has not been announced by the Orioles at the time we're recording this, which is Monday night. In fact, the news just broke a couple of hours ago. The 40-man roster did stand at 40 players when this transaction was first reported. So someone will get DFA'd, but it's still a question at this point of who. Earlier last week, the Orioles signed utility man Adam Frazier to a 1-year, $8 million contract. Frazier was an all-star in 2021 with the Pirates and then was traded to the Padres as they made their not very successful attempt at a playoff push that season. Frazier then went to the Mariners last year and saw his numbers regress in a lot of areas offensively. He has, however, remained a consistently solid defender at second base and continues to maintain good chase rate numbers, walks at a high clip, does not strike out. So for the Orioles, this seems to be a move built on two ideas. Number one, that in what could be kind of a platoon scenario, Frazier gives you that left-handed bat who you know is going to be a steady hand at second base and can play the corner outfield spots. The other factor is they seem to believe they can get Adam Frazier back to a better version of himself. I should add, a better version of Adam Frazier is not a guy that's going to bring a lot of power to the lineup, and it's not going to hit the ball particularly hard, but he's going to make contact. He's going to get on base. He's not going to strike out. So I guess where I'll start, because I think this is really the more interesting question for us as a minor league. So I'll start with Bob here, which is that it does feel like while Frazier fills a need that the Orioles probably have when you look at their roster right now, could Terrin Vavra have conceivably done the same thing? Or do you think that maybe the floor with Frazier is higher and that's why the Orioles are making this move? Because as I'm looking at it, to me, there's a clear redundancy between Frazier and Vavra if we're considering them for next year's opening day roster.
Yeah, it's funny you ask that because I was about to say, seems the Orioles are asking the question, why play Terrin Vavra when you could sign Terrin Vavra for $8 million and play him instead? But no, I think that the Orioles are not exactly thrilled with Vavra's defense at second base. I think we know that just the way they played him last year, playing Rougned Odor over anybody. It's not exactly a pat on the back as far as we trust your defense, but maybe they envision Vavra more as a center field, left field type. And Frazier's a guy that can man second base. He's got a really good glove there, consistent with the ground ball pitchers they're bringing in with the defense that we had last year. And yeah, I don't think he's blocking anyone per se, but I do expect him to start second base pretty much every day for the first half of the season as guys like Connor Norby, Joey Ortiz, Jordan Westberg get, acclimated to the major league level or get ready to get promoted to the major league level. And then he can maybe play more corner outfield when that time comes or be a utility guy off the bench. Hopefully that's the case. But I think if you're the Orioles, and this is the balance part that's kind of tough where, you want, obviously you don't want to block the young guys, but you also don't want to rely on guys with no major league experience coming into a season in which you're hoping to contend for a playoff spot. So I feel like it's kind of just playing the middle game there where he can start the season every day in the lineup, and hopefully as guys graduate to the majors and prove that they belong there and are going to be above average players, regulars at second base or whatever position, then he can slide into a utility backup role. And hopefully that's the case. But yeah, it wasn't exactly the sexiest signing in the world, but I can see the reason they did it and what they're thinking here, even if it doesn't give Orioles Twitter much reason to be happy.
Does anything at this point. But yeah, at first, I honestly did not like the move. I thought it was unnecessary. Started to kind of find myself drifting towards that side of the fandom that's up in arms about what's happened, or more importantly, what hasn't happened this offseason. But at this point, this is why I like to sit on this for a couple of days. I'm fine with the move. Clearly the Orioles value defense. We went over this with the Jahmai Jones Civil War. We went over this last year with Terrin Vavra at second base. They're not going to put those guys there. We had to watch Rougned Odor almost every night at second base because the defense, because the leadership he brought, blah, blah, blah. We know that. But Frazier has that solid defensive floor. We know that. Even in the outfield, the defensive numbers, I know not everybody likes those, take them for what you will, but the publicly available defensive numbers that we have, he wasn't terrible in the outfield either. So I'm fine with that. You raise the floor. Vivek's made this comment a couple of times there. You're raising the floor of the defense, which I'm cool with. As far as offensive numbers, we know who Frazier is. Like they're not signing him because they think they can unlock something. Like he's not going to be a 275, 300 hitter or above a 300 hitter who hits 20 plus home runs. Like he's a career 273 hitter who's pretty much league average with every metric, except he has fantastic control of the strike zone. Is it redundant that they have him in Vavra? I don't think he blocks Vavra. I think Vavra can still play. I still think Terran Vavra is going to be a big leaguer for a very long time in some capacity with some organization. I just think he's still an unproven prospect, right? He could totally regress next season. And maybe he doesn't have that control. Maybe he's not getting on base like he was last year or like he was in the minor leagues. Maybe his strikeouts climb as pitchers adjust to him and he can't adjust back. We don't know. Frazier's there as the safe floor to fall back on, if so. And you can still work him more gradually, because I think that's the thing. Like, even if Jordan Westburg comes up, is he going to play every single day at his position? I doubt it. Connor Norby's not. Joey Ortiz isn't. I think the Orioles are going to gradually work their guys in and put creative lineups together every single night. And so for that instance, like, it's 1 year, $8 million. He's not brought in to block anybody, and I don't necessarily think it means someone's getting traded as soon as possible. Everyone wants to immediately trade off Jordan Westburg because we signed Adam Frazier. I don't personally see that connection, but
yeah, I mean, if Adam Frazier would have repeated 2021, he probably would have got what, 2 years, 20 million, 2 years, 24 million, something like that. And they think he's a guy that is going to be able to bounce back. I love the quote from Adam Frazier in an interview where it's like the front office and him are exactly on the same page about how to improve from the bad year he had this past season. And, you know, he's basically a league average hitter. If you can get league average hitter at a second base with above average defense, that's a big improvement over what we had last year. That's for sure. And then hopefully you have a chance to even improve upon that in the second half once guys like Connor Norby and Jordan Westburg and Joey Ortiz are ready to take over.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, Terran Vavra spent some time in the IL at Norfolk last year, and I'm looking over his numbers now, and between the major leagues and the minor leagues last year, so that includes some time rehabbing with Aberdeen, he ended up with just 39 games at second base. Now, obviously, he missed a good chunk of time, as I mentioned, with injury, but the Orioles have sort of been moving him into more of that utility mold. He spent 17 games in center field at Norfolk compared to 22 at second base. So it's going to be interesting to me to figure out how Frazier and Vavra fit onto this roster together. But perhaps it is that Vavra is more of a left-handed hitting fourth or fifth outfielder who plays second base sometimes, while your true second baseman is Adam Frazier.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, you know, if Vavra does stick around through this period and Frazier's a one and done kind of guy, he's a player that if he's on the bench with this guy and in spring training with this guy, he can learn a lot from him going forward. So, you know, they're similar players, but Frazier's a veteran. Maybe he can teach Vavra, even if it's just through osmosis, so just being around him, that, you know, here's how to be a successful veteran, or not veteran, but just major leaguer, and the process of that type of player can go through to stay, I don't know, consistent, I don't know, healthy, whatever. But I just feel like he could learn from him, or he can knock him out and take his job at some point during the season. Not literally knock him out, but
yeah. I mean, none of this is sexy. None of this is fun, I think, to really talk about. Like, we're struggling here to come up, I think, with an interesting conversation with Adam Frazier. Like, I am, at least, but like it's fine. I think like it's a safe signing, and if this was an extra signing after they signed someone else big, it wouldn't be really talked about. I think it would be a lot of more positive. Like, yeah, we don't know exactly what we have in Terran Vavra. We don't know exactly what we have in Kyle Stowers. Like, what if Kyle Stowers is hitting 215, striking out 40% of the time, and just can't bring it next season? I hope not. But what if that's the case? Adam Frazier's not going to do that, and you can plug Frazier into the outfield. So I think that's your fallback option. Again, I don't think this means that the organization is ready to trade Stowers or Vavra or Westburg or anybody. It's just one of those things right now. And you know, maybe if it does, like, I'm thinking about it, like, what if this does lead to a trade? Let me feed into that. Like, I'd imagine it's more likely. Would this mean that Ramon Arias is possibly in a move? There's a lot of conversations there with other teams, and the Orioles think they're going to be able to pull a trigger there with Ramon Arias trade. I think that'd be more likely than the Orioles about to trade a bunch of prospects, if I'm being honest. But what do I know with this front office?
Jorge Mateo to the Braves in a package for Max Fried. Let's go.
Well, we got a lot of the off season left. This is a few notes here. First of all, Nick, happy birthday. So we wrap up our last live show of 2022 on Nick's birthday. However, we are going to have a new episode out next week that will be pre-recorded. So if something happens that pisses off Orioles Twitter between now and next Monday and we don't have reaction to it, know it's because it was recorded before that thing happened. But we still got a fun show in the works. You're going to want to check that out. And if you're a member of our Patreon community, we might have a fun surprise coming for you here in the next week or so. And if you're not a patron member yet, you can sign up for as little as $3 a month. So consider doing that. Also, check out BaltimoreSportsAndLife.com, where you will not only find Bob's projected rosters, but you'll also see coverage on the Orioles, Ravens, college sports, and more. And while you're on the site, be sure to join the discussion with fellow readers as well as contributors over at the message board. And follow us on Twitter at BSL on the Verge. For Bob Phelan and Nick Stevens, this is Zach Spedden. You've been listening to On the Verge.